In school, you were probably taught history as a neat timeline of facts. Dates, names, battles, end of story. But that's not how humans really work. We're storytellers. We hyperbolize. We turn a spark into a wildfire and a rumor into a legend. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes it's propaganda. But sometimes it's just because a better story survives longer than a boring one. But history does love drama. Not because the past was always explosive, but because people are. We stretch moments. We inflate victories. We polish disasters until over time they sparkle. But lies don't just decorate history. They rewrite it entirely. So today, we're diving into some exaggerated stories from history. Tales that started with something real, and then got wildly out of hand. Some were meant to inspire, some were meant to scare, and some, well, they were just too good not to embellish. The Trojan horse, the world's most convenient lie. According to the stories, the Greeks spent 10 long years failing to conquer Troy. And then suddenly, genius struck. They built a massive wooden horse, hid soldiers inside, pretended to sail away, and waited. The Trojans would drag it into their city walls, and that night the soldiers jumped out. Troy burned. Roll credits. Right? It's elegant, it's clever, but it's probably exaggerated to all hell. Archaeologists have never found evidence of a giant horse. No hinges, no hollow structure, no definitely a horse-shaped debris pile. More likely, the horse was symbolic. Some historians think that it referred to a siege engine, others believed it was a metaphor for betrayal, and a few argue it was simply propaganda. An embarrassing defeat that was reframed as a masterstroke. The lesson stuck though. Deception, it became legendary. And one metaphor turned into a wooden icon that still gets referenced 3,000 years later. The uncivilized barbarians. It wasn't just the Greeks that were masters of propaganda. When the Romans talked about their enemies, they loved one word: barbarians. The implication was clear. These people were savage, uneducated, lawless, and barely human. The truth? Many so-called barbarian societies had complex laws, rich traditions, skilled craftsmen, and deep spiritual systems. Some of them bathed more often than the Romans did, and had more equitable social structures. But exaggeration is a very powerful tool. If your enemy's a monster, then conquering them feels justified. If they're inferior, then defeating them feels inevitable. Roman historians cranked the volume on every negative trait up to 11. Violence was amplified, intelligence was minimized, and nuance was erased. Centuries later, we're still untangling propaganda from fact, trying to understand cultures that were flattened into caricatures by the winners. History didn't just exaggerate them, it erased them with style. Viking helmets with horns. Ask anyone to picture a Viking. They'll say big beard, axe, rage issues, and a horned helmet. But here's the problem. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets. Not in battle, not casually, not ever. Horned helmets would have been useless in a fight. They'd snag on weapons, they would mess up your balance, and they would give your head a really convenient handle. So where did this idea come from? Of all places, 19th century opera. Yeah, I know, everyone's favorite, the opera. Costume designers, they wanted the Vikings to look dramatic on stage. Horns, they looked fierce. Audiences loved it. Artists copied it. Then textbooks started repeating it. And suddenly, a theatrical fashion choice became historical fact. Real Viking helmets were simple domes with nose bridges. Practical. Boring even. But boring doesn't sell. So history once again chose spectacle over accuracy, and now an entire civilization is remembered for an accessory that they never used. George Washington and the cherry tree. You probably know this one. A young George Washington chops down a cherry tree, and when confronted, he says, "I cannot tell a lie." His honesty impresses everyone. Moral learned, history made. Except none of it ever happened. That story was invented decades after Washington's death by a man named Mason Locke Weems, a traveling book salesman who desperately needed his biography to sell better. There were never any diary entries about it, no witnesses, not even a cherry tree stump. Weems, he wasn't trying to deceive people maliciously, though. He was building a role model. Washington, the flawless child, he fit that need perfectly. The exaggeration worked a little too well, though. Now generations of people remember Washington less as a complex military leader and more as the poster boy for honesty itself. A fictional childhood moment became a national lesson, and it was repeated so often, it started to sound official. But it wasn't history. It was branding. Rasputin, the man who refused to die. Grigory Rasputin's death reads like a rejected movie script. According to popular retellings, he was poisoned, then shot, then beaten, and drowned. But somehow he still wouldn't die. What was the truth? He was murdered brutally, but not supernaturally. Medical evidence suggests that the poison never worked, likely because it wasn't administered properly. He was shot multiple times, which alone would have killed him. And the drowning part, it was probably added later to heighten the horror of this man. But why exaggerate in the first place? It was because Rasputin terrified people. He was a peasant who gained influence over the Russian royal family. He didn't look the part, he didn't act the part, and that made him dangerous in the public's imagination. So, turning him into an unkillable monster justified that fear. It transformed a political assassination into a mythic victory over something unnatural. Rasputin, he didn't refuse to die. The story just refused to let him be ordinary. The Wild West. According to pop culture, the Wild West was non-stop chaos. Gunfights at noon, outlaws everywhere, and lawlessness on every street corner. But in reality, most frontier towns were surprisingly calm. Gun control laws existed, sheriffs enforced order, and many towns even banned carrying firearms in public. Shootouts were rare, and murder rates were often lower than in modern cities. So how did the West become so wild? Like newspapers do, they exaggerate. Violence, it sells more copies. Dime store novels dramatized everything, and Hollywood later poured gasoline onto the myth. A minor dispute became a legendary duel. A criminal became a feared outlaw, and a quiet town became a blood-soaked battlefield. The Wild West was just more exciting than the real one. So that's the version that survived. The Titanic, the so-called unsinkable ship. Although, the Titanic was never officially labeled as unsinkable by its builders. But the newspapers didn't care. Before the ship even launched, headlines began calling it practically unsinkable. Journalists, they leaned into this idea. Advertisements echoed it, and public confidence ballooned. By the time it hit the iceberg, the exaggeration had already done its damage. Passengers, they ignored warnings. Lifeboat drills were completely skipped, and safety concerns felt unnecessary, because how could something this advanced possibly fail? But after the disaster, the exaggeration completely flipped. The ship became a symbol for human arrogance. The story, it turned moralistic. The pride before the fall. Man challenging nature. And losing. The reality was more complicated. There were design flaws, poor decisions that were made, and outdated safety regulations. But complexity, it doesn't stick. The headline, "Unsinkable Ship Sinks," does. The Great Wall of China is visible from space. You've probably heard this one in school too. The Great Wall is so massive that it's visible from space. It isn't. If you don't believe me, you can check for yourself if you open up Google Earth. Even astronauts have confirmed this repeatedly. From low Earth orbit, the wall is nearly impossible to see with the naked eye. It blends into the shape of the landscape far too well. Almost like that's what it was designed to do. So how did this idea spread? It started in the 18th century, long before space travel existed. Writers speculated about it, then textbooks copied it. Teachers repeated it, and nobody bothered to check because, at the time, nobody could. Once humans actually went to space, though, the myth was already too cemented. The exaggeration survived because it sounded impressive. It made human achievement feel cosmic. But the truth, that scale doesn't always equal visibility, that's less exciting. Roswell, the crash that connected our worlds. In 1947, something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. The military initially said it was a flying disc. Then, they quickly corrected themselves. Actually, it was a weather balloon. And that should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the most famous alien story in modern history. Over time, the object grew stranger. The debris, it became unearthly. Witnesses remembered things that they hadn't mentioned before. Rumors of alien bodies even appeared decades later. But always secondhand, of course. But what really happened? The crash was almost certainly part of Project Mogul, a classified program using high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear testing. The secrecy surrounding it definitely didn't help, and the initial press release poured gasoline on the fire. Once the Cold War hit full paranoia mode, Roswell transformed from awkward military mistake into the government is hiding extraterrestrials in a desert warehouse and you need to get your tinfoil hats ready. Each retelling added more detail. Each documentary added more drama. Each generation upgraded the mystery. A classified balloon became a crashed spaceship from another world. Confusion turned into conspiracy. And uncertainty did what it always does. It invited more exaggeration. So why does exaggeration always win out in the end? These stories do something that facts alone can't. They entertain, they simplify, and they stick like glue. These stories, they survive because they're easier to remember than the truth. And they turn uncertainty into confidence. They turn complexity into clarity. And they give events sharp edges instead of blurry ones. So the next time that you hear a historical fact that feels a little too perfect, too poetic, too cinematic, it's worth asking, was it remembered because it's true or because it was unforgettable? Sometimes those aren't the same thing. History isn't just a record of events, it's a collection of stories that people choose to repeat. The louder, the stranger, and the more dramatic the tale is, the more likely it is to outlive the truth. But that doesn't make history useless by any means. It just means that we should listen more carefully, more skeptically. Because behind every legendary horse, every horned helmet, every oversized conspiracy, and honest child, there's a quieter, more human story waiting to be heard. And honestly, sometimes that one's even better. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. Leave a comment if you have any stories from history that you find interesting. Maybe a little too interesting to be believable. Or, if you have any suggestions for videos you want to see in the future, drop them down below. We may just talk about it. Peace.